My name is Paul James. I'm the Director of Development and Publishing for the Knoxville History Project. And our mission is to bring you Knoxville's history, promote it, research it. So I've got to get started on a couple of announcements, and then I'll turn it over to Jack. Again, our mission is very simple. We research and promote the history and culture of Knoxville. We've been doing it for about 5 years. I want to put out a couple of shout outs for a couple of things. Some of you may know of our program called Knoxville Shoebox. We are actively seeking old photographs, posters, maps, brochures, ephemera, could be old gig tickets, show posters, anything really that's in the past that might be interesting, that can connect a story. And we're not asking you to donate these things. We're asking you to share them digitally. We're also doing a new column in a new magazine. This is City Lifestyle. The latest, the Knoxville one is called West Knoxville Lifestyle. It goes to 10,000 homes in West Knoxville area. So if you live in that region, you may have seen it, or you might be able to pick it up from somewhere. But we launched a new article series with them, and you can find these online. And I've asked Nicole to put the link in the chat bar if you want to go and check it out. Also, if you're not subscribing to our newsletter, you can subscribe on our website, knoxvilleproject.org. And if you go over to our portal and check on the Knoxville Shoebox collection in the portal area, we post one every 2 weeks. It's the same one that goes in our newsletter. But again, if you have old postcards or old photographs, we'd love to talk to you about them. Also, I want to put a shout out for our good friend and partner, Laura Still, with the Knoxville Walking Tours. If you're bored and want to get out and join a very, very small group, wearing a mask and have a great experience around downtown, whether it's Knoxville early history or Civil War, music, literature. Laura's been doing these for several years. We love working with Laura, and she makes a donation every time to the Knoxville History Project. So encourage you to go out and do a walking tour with Laura, even during the pandemic. So go to knoxvillewalkingtours.com. And also want to encourage you to help us continue the work that we're doing for you and the community. We feel like we're adding great value, telling the Knoxville story, and we appreciate a donation. Many of you are already supporting us through an annual donation, but if you are new and you'd like to just put a few dollars in our chat bar link, we sincerely appreciate it. So that's me done tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Jack. And Jack, take it away for Knoxville's secret exotic past.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm reading a fascinating new book called Metropolis, and it's a history of cities going back 6,000 years. And one theme keeps coming up, that the great cities that we remember from Hong Kong to London are cities that welcomed newcomers, that had lots of exotic influences from around the world, and they built on these influences and mixed them in different ways. And I would like to think that this might apply to my hometown. People always assume Knoxville is Scottish or Irish or Scots-Irish or just American, that people don't think of exotic influences when they think of Knoxville, but I think perhaps they should. In school, I remember growing up seeing documentaries about Italian or Eastern European immigration to America, and Ellis Island and all that, and I assumed it really didn't have a lot to do with Knoxville, but I was mistaken about that, to put it simply. Immigration has played a major role in Knoxville history, especially from the 1790s, from the decade we were founded, and when the city was full of immigrants, to roughly about 1920, and I think continues to today. But during this early period is the one we're talking about, this 130 years, the first 130 years of Knoxville history, when it welcomed lots of people from lots of different places. During this period, interestingly, we had 6 mayors from foreign countries. Mayors, we elected mayors of Knoxville who had foreign accents, and 2 of whom grew up speaking other languages other than English. And in fact, the only mayor of North Knoxville was one of those who grew up speaking another language. His name was Louis Gratz. But waves of immigration from Germany, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Ireland, and to a lesser degree, France, Poland, Lithuania, Greece, and also some Asians have left a permanent mark on Knoxville, on its physical presence and its culture. And we'll be talking about how that came about, how all these different people, fascinating stories. And I wish I could tell all these stories. We've got hours and hours of information that I'm going to try to collapse into 1 hour tonight. And we should, before we embark on this this voyage, I should mention that that many of our immigrants in the early days were involuntary immigrants. They were from Africa, African Americans who we don't know as much about them as we should. In fact, this week on his show, Henry Louis Gates mentioned that it's very difficult to research African American history because often slaves were mentioned just by gender and age. In various accounting methods, but we find out a little bit more every year, it seems. But enslaved or free, most of the African Americans who lived here in the early days were probably multi-generational Americans by the time they arrived in Knoxville. I think the last lecture I saw before the lockdown was a lecture by Michael Twitty last year about the African influence on American culture, especially Southern cuisine, and he made a long talk just on that one subject. So we will come back around to African American culture quite a lot, as we have in the past, in the year to come. But today we're talking about immigrants, mostly from Europe, who came here and had an effect on the city and its culture. All these stories offer glimpses into world history, and you might recognize a lot of these stories from memories of Western Civ in college, in fact, because you can almost tell the story of world history through Knoxville. In fact, local history is global history, and you can't really study a city like Knoxville without studying the history of the world. I want to begin, and many of these people we don't think of as foreigners. A lot of the names that we take for granted in Knoxville are so familiar that we think of them as just Knoxville names. But the classic example is the first one I'm going to be talking about. His name was Jordi Faragut Mesquita was his full formal name. He was from Minorca, Spain. We knew him here as George Farragut. This is the father of the famous admiral, but as you can see from his uniform, he was a Navy man himself. He began sailing from this island in the Mediterranean as a young man, and in fact was involved in some naval warfare on the Black Sea with the Turks when he was in his youth. But he came to America. I think he had a grudge against the British, in fact, and came over here to fight the British in the Revolutionary War. He's remembered in Knoxville history as George Farragut and as one of the early settlers here, and he's even listed in the earliest histories of Knoxville as an early settler. But he's become more famous just in the last 5 or 6 years as people become more aware of Latino culture in America, and he's perhaps one of the best known Latino patriots in the American Revolution. There are just a handful of them, but he's one of them. And it's interesting that he was a friend of William Blount and came here to live in Knoxville for several years, and in fact ended up running a ferry across the Tennessee River down near Concord. That's why the community of Farragut got his name later on. But even people we think of as purely Tennessee, like John Sevier, our first governor, is more exotic than we imagine. He was not a Scots-Irish kind of guy. He was his father was an immigrant from England, but was not English. His father was named Valentine Sevier. His great-grandfather was named Don Juan de Xavier. That was where Sevier came from. They were from a Franco-Spanish family. So he was kind of a darker complected guy who was much respected by all these Scots-Irish and other people in East Tennessee. So we never should assume that these people are just one culture or another. But other people like John Chisholm, of course, was from Scotland. He had a tavern here. There were several early Irish, mainly Scots-Irish, although they called themselves Irish in those days. One was named John Adair, who's well remembered in Fountain City. He was the first settler of the Fountain City area. but he's also one of at least 2 Irish signers of the Tennessee Constitution. We'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks. This kind of bold and impertinent, perhaps, effort to start a state without permission from Congress in 1796. He was one of a couple of foreigners in this group of people who got together and created a constitution. But other things like we take for granted, like the James Park House downtown, is a classic old house, but it was finished and lived in by the Park family, who were from Northern Ireland. James Park himself was from Northern Ireland, and he was our second mayor. He had an Irish accent. But so was Thomas Humes, who lived around the corner. He built the front of what we know of as the Bijou Theater. The Lamar House was Thomas Humes's house, and he died before it was completed, but his wife finished it and ran it as a hotel. But there was a new wave of Scots-Irish refugees in 1798, and connected with a well-known figure that I grew up just reading about in history books and like in high school even, is a guy named Wolfe Tone, who has led an Irish revolt against the crown in 1798. We think of Irish rebellions as being Catholic in nature. Wolfe Tone and his followers were Presbyterians who were fighting against the British crown in 1798. And this was fiercely put down in Ireland, and sending a lot of refugees, not hundreds at least, to America, and just to escape with their lives during the reign of George III. And at least a few came to Knoxville. One of them is named John Nevin, and he's interesting because he's well remembered in Northern Ireland as one of the leaders of this revolt, and he ended up here in Knoxville, Tennessee, for about 7 years. I want to read a bit. There's actually I ran across this some years ago, a memorial jar in his memory that tells his story, and it's been on display in a museum that's near the Bushmills whiskey distillery in Northern Ireland. And this jug, I should say, I'll just read what it says on the side there. It says, "To the memory of John Nevin of Kilmoyle, who was by the foes of reform banished from his native home in June 1798. He lived in the state of exile for 7 years, 11 months, 8 days, and departed his life in Knoxfield," they didn't get the name right, "Knoxfield, Tennessee, ye 19th of May, 1806. Much lamented by all his friends, acquaintances in their country." But there's been a letter of his discovered, written from Knoxville to his friends in Ireland in 1804. He said, "Here I enjoy equal right and privileges of the governor, and I am an equal companion of our first rank, whilst you must pour out your purse to the landlords." He was telling his old compatriots in Northern Ireland that they'd be better off in Knoxville, basically. But an interesting guy. We don't know exactly where he's buried. His companion actually was buried off of Lovell Road. I'm kind of regret to say that his grave, which always seemed poignant to me, was recently moved out of the way for a school building, which I'm not sure actually where it is now, but it's he was the guy buried there came with John Nevin. Anyway, I just want to mention this early kind of group of Irish refugees, because we're going to get back to the Irish more later on. But there were a few other Irish people who made some contribution to the early days. Most of these were from Northern Ireland, like John Nevin, but some were from the Catholic parts of Ireland, including a guy named James Dardis, who lived in Knoxville, probably the first Catholic person to live in Knoxville. He was one of our first aldermen, and much respected when we first had the very first city council of seven guys. He was one of them. In fact, there were 3 Irishmen on that first city council. It was tough to maintain the Catholic faith without a priest, and more later about that, how that problem was solved. But for a long time, Knoxville kind of languished, especially after we lost a capital status and people weren't coming here. More people were leaving than coming, I think. And but by the 1840s, Knoxville was catching a second wind. It was no longer capital, but now it had a school for the deaf, and people were expecting the railroad to come through and change the place and make the place an industrial center. And what happened in the 1840s? Anybody that remembers Western Civ, a big, usually often their whole chapter of it is about the revolutions of 1848. And this is a time when Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, Italians all came to tried to rebel in their homes to create democratic reforms, very much like the Arab Spring in recent years. And the result of it was unfortunately very similar. These were not successful in most places. They were put down brutally throughout Central Europe, and these people fled for their lives, and many of them came to America. By some accounts, as many as 1 million people came to America from Germany and adjacent nations. But they many of them came to Knoxville during this period. Part of the reason they came here was that there was a place that had been set up in the wilderness of the Cumberlands that they called Wartburg. They named it after a well-known city in Germany, Wartburg. We of course know it as Wartburg in Morgan County. But among these people who came to Wartburg was a guy from Leipzig named Gustavus Canaba. He was a guy who'd been in Mendelssohn's orchestra. He knew Wagner and Mendelssohn, all these folks. And Schumann was a good friend of his, and both Schumanns. But he came to Wartburg, was there for a couple of years, and decided he'd rather live in a city, and eventually migrated to Knoxville. Founded our first symphony group in the mid 1860s, and it should also be remembered by UT as the kind of the godfather of the Pride of the Southland marching band. He taught music at UT in those early days when UT was very, very small. But he started the first band, and his son actually led it into the marching band era. Another person that came to Wartburg was a guy named Rudolph Naffel, K-N-A-F-F-L. His son Joseph came to Knoxville and became one of our best known photographers ever. And another couple of people who came here about that time were Emil and Emma Crouch. They had actually some minor royalty in their lineage. But they were music teachers. Emil was a music teacher, and he ended up in Knoxville, and his whole very creative family came here. His son, Charles, became a well-known painter. His grandson, Joseph Wood Crouch, became a well-known writer. His other grandson, Charlie Crouch, became a photographer, and also the guy that left us with Crouch Park downtown. But a lot of these German people, many of them who'd come to Wartburg and then had come to Knoxville just because they weren't ready for the harsh circumstances of a small town in the middle of the wilderness at the time, and many of them, some of them, they were disappointed with farming, came into Knoxville and kind of met each other and started a German society called the Turnverein. Which was a very vigorous group that met, was active for probably 40 years or so in the late Victorian era. A German-speaking group. They had dances, Germans they call them sometimes, but they also founded their own park, Turner Park, back in the days when Knoxville didn't have public parks to speak of. The Turnverein started their own, and it was kind of just east of Broadway, across from where Kroger is there, up toward getting close to North Hills area. But Turner Park became a gathering place, not just for the Germans, but they would let other people join them too. But the Germans started all sorts of things, but there are a few individuals I want to talk about right away. One is named, I think we have him next. Is that Peter Kern? Is the next guy to talk to. He was not part of the Wartburg Germans. He came here kind of as an accident of war. He'd been a farmer in the Deep South, and it arrived here as a refugee with all maybe on the same boat as some of these other folks, but ended up in the deep South, had a small farm, and he, like a lot of small farmers, he went off to war on the Confederate side. He was wounded early in the war, was sent home, and ended up dutifully on his way back to the front in Virginia when Knoxville was seized by the Union Army. They captured him, decided he was not a threat of any sort, and they said, we'll let you go as long as you stay in Knoxville for the balance of the war. Here was a German guy who had never been in Knoxville before in his life. He met another German who had this idea he said, I've got $1 for a barrel of flour. If you have $1 for a barrel of molasses, let's make hoe cakes for their Union troop trains to go through, and sell hoe cakes for a penny each or something like that, and see how we do. And they did actually very well. And he started a bakery and built Kern's Bakery. And not only that, but Kern was also a candy maker, and he tried all sorts of things. He made soft drinks. He had the biggest soft drink machine in town. He had an ice cream machine, and all these things were all in the Kern building, which I'm glad to say is still intact on Market Square. It's where Tupelo Honey and the Oliver is today. That's the Kern building. That was his building, the one that he built in the 1870s. It replaced a previous building that he had worked out of for years. But very, very popular guy, and perhaps a very influential guy. I think that he was one of the people who kind of taught us how to celebrate some holidays like Christmas, for example. He and his wife always put up a Christmas tree, which was kind of a new thing in Tennessee. But he was so popular that he was elected mayor in 1890. Can you imagine a mayor with a German accent? But he had a great deal of influence on other folks. But also in Market Square, if you look around on Market Square, you see only one historic word on the whole square. And if you look at all the buildings, just one word engraved in a building, and that word is the name Ziegler. And it's on 9 Market Square, just about 2 doors away from Peter Kern's place. Adolf Ziegler was another German immigrant. He teamed up with another couple of German-speaking immigrants, a guy named Mettler, who I think was from Switzerland, a German-speaking Swiss guy, and another guy named Ignaz Fanz, F-A-N-Z. And they were for a while Knoxville's famously best sausage makers in town. They had a place on Market Square, and they eventually had a sausage factory outside of town as well. But you still see that name Ziegler up there. We think it's because Ziegler was one who financed the construction of this building where Mettler, Ziegler, and Fanz were located for some years. But the Germans had a lot of influence on culture. I think that the Germans are the reason that we, even in recent years, still had this classic Knoxville dish, Metwurst and beans, Mets and beans. This must have started somewhere, and I can't imagine anywhere else it could have started except on Market Square with the Germans. They made like 40 different kinds of sausage that they sold on Market Square. The Germans brought their culture with them. They weren't all one culture either. Some of the Germans were Catholics, some were Lutherans, and some were Jews. And they all came here and founded or joined groups that suited what they were used to at home in the old country. The most German of all churches is First Lutheran Church, which was founded here in Knoxville in the 1860s. It was actually founded at Kern's place. Peter Kern hosted kind of the founding of this church, and this was the church was built some years later. A church at the corner of Broadway and Fifth. I'm sorry, it's gone now. But this was a German language Lutheran church and was for decades into the 20th century. This was you would go there and you would hear the services conducted in German. First Lutheran still exists and celebrates their German heritage with festivals, but they don't speak German in church anymore. But that was one way they expressed their culture. But I mentioned earlier that many of the Germans who came over were Jewish people, and they came over just alongside the other German refugees. And many of them arrived in Knoxville and founded the first synagogue in town, and it was called Temple Bethel. And it was founded by a couple of refugees from Bavaria, Julius and Bertha Ox or Oaks, as they probably pronounce it, OCHS. They were Bertha had actually been one of the revolutionaries. She had waved a bloody flag in the middle of a mob or something. I think Julius was just a more of a sympathizer, but they got together and helped found this the first synagogue in town. But we're also members of Turnverein, and Julius was a very strong supporter of Prussia. And it's interesting that these immigrants in America were still strongly supporting their countries back home in many ways. Julius Ox did a play based on the Franco-Prussian War, and in which he portrayed Prussia as the better of the two, but there were actually people in Knoxville who were supporting the Franco side of the Franco-Prussian War, and some of them actually went there to help fight or aid over there. But Julius and Bertha had a son named Adolf Ox. I might have gotten this out of order here, Paul, but we have a picture of him somewhere. I'll just wait till we get to there. But our next slide is about something else the Germans brought, and it was something that's very popular. In fact, I'm drinking one right now, beer. Beer was something that people had heard of, and this was something that I think some people made kind of crude versions of in this part of the country before that. But beer really didn't catch on until the German immigration of after the revolutions of 1848. In fact, the beer I'm drinking right now is called Miller High Life, and it's actually named for a guy named Mueller, who is part of the same wave of refugees that brought all these other people I've been talking about, Peter Kern and Gustavus Canaba and everybody else. They all these, and Budweiser, everybody else started about the same time, and we had our own brewery here as well. This is kind of the high point of brewing in Knoxville in the 1890s. And you see this, they're making this Bock beer. This is the brewery that was located down on McGee Street at Chamberlain, which hardly exists anymore, but is between downtown and Mechanicsville. This is not far from where that homeless camp that was recently evacuated under the highway. But this was a brewery that I was very proud of for many years, and it was run mainly by German people. But it was preceded by a couple of other breweries that were here in town, going back at least the 1860s, perhaps earlier, that we had German breweries along Second Creek mainly. Anyway, I'm trying to remember the next slide is. What do we have next, Paul?
Cemetery.
Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, this is Victor Berger, born at Stebach, Bavaria, died 1902, and you might notice at the very bottom there's something that's not exactly English down there. That's a Hebrew inscription. By the 1860s, there were enough Jewish people to establish a very small cemetery in East Knoxville, and it's still there. It's off of Linden at Harriet Tubman, I believe. But here's another one, Simon Sunshine, and if you can read that, he's born in Austria-Hungary in the 1850s, and he was again part of this wave of immigration. And again, you see some Hebrew on that one as well. But yeah, this is right here in Knoxville, and it's been here always. This is what they call the old Jewish cemetery, which is a very small. It's about the size of a small backyard. There's another new Jewish cemetery that's much larger over off Keith Avenue, but this is the first one, but it dates back to the 1860s. But next we have, I think, the picture of Adolf Ox, who is the son of Julius and Bertha Ox that I talked about earlier. Adolf Ox is rather famous. He's the guy that he grew up in Knoxville, had all of his formal education here, and began his career in journalism here in the 1870s. But he later went on to Chattanooga and bought a paper called the Chattanooga Times and made a successful paper of it, so successful that he hired most of his family from Knoxville to come down there and help him with it. And then moved on to New York and bought a paper called the New York Times, and really created the New York Times as we know it today, because everything you think of at the Times, that from the book review to the magazine to all these things, were Adolf Ox's idea, his innovations to the Times. One of the most famous people who ever came from Knoxville is Adolf Ox, and again, he's the son of very recent German Jewish refugees who were part of this great change that came over the city. Next slide, we actually have a picture of one of the Temple of Bethel in a later, somewhat later period. This is Temple of Bethel at Broadway and West Vine, and this part of West Vine doesn't even exist anymore. This is actually just downhill from where Paul and I are sitting tonight. But this was had been a church before that, but the temple bought it after the church left and established their synagogue there. Adolf Fox, by the way, donated a font of some kind that went into that building as a memorial, I think, to his parents. And I don't know what became of that. If anyone out there knows, I would love to find out. Anyway, another very prominent Jewish German family was another couple who were not part of this original group of people who came to Knoxville. They lived other places first, but the Arnsteins, Max and Lala Arnstein, came to Knoxville and were very prosperous merchants on Gay Street first until in about 1906. They built this just magnificent building. This was called a skyscraper and was the tallest building in Knoxville, just a wonder to behold in 1906. It was the first building ever built with steel frame construction in Knoxville. Steel frame construction meant you could build much higher and not worry so much about it as you did earlier. But Max and Lala were both very successful merchants. This was a department store and considered one of the finest, probably the finest department store in Knoxville. Lala helped there, but she was also known for other things, and that one of the things was politics. She was one of the very first women to be elected to public office. She was elected to county court in 1924, I believe. Laura may correct me on that. I think that's right. But of course, Max and Lala also founded the Ernestine Jewish Community Center, which still bears their name today. It was originally downtown, is now in West Knoxville. But they hired a New York architect, Cleverton and Putzel, to come down here and design this building. But it's really just one of the finest buildings in Knoxville. But it was within a few years that we started building as soon as people saw how this worked, how well the steel frame construction worked, they began building much taller buildings. So, but we could, I think, may consider Arnstein the father of the skyscraper in Knoxville. Meanwhile, we've talked mainly about Germans. There was during the same time as all this unrest in Central Europe, there was a lot of trouble in Switzerland. We don't think about Switzerland and having unrest and that sort of thing. But in fact, the very last war ever fought in Switzerland was called the Sonderbund War, which led to a lot of instability and a lot of different kinds of oppression, including religious oppression, and a great deal of a great many Swiss came to America during this time. Some were German Swiss, and they had their own motives for coming here, and we'll talk a bit more about them in a minute. I'm trying to think if they're Paul gave me a great list of all the sides we have, and I'm all right. Let's talk about the German Swiss first. They include the Sturkey family, who are very well known, and a lot of people come here and see this unusual name, Sturkey, they'd never seen before, but it's very common in some parts of German-speaking Switzerland. John Sturkey was the immigrant, and he settled on the north side of town, had a bit of a farm, but was his son Sturkey, I'm trying to remember, his name was James Sturkey, was and his brother started Surrey Brothers Furniture Company, which became the biggest furniture company in Knoxville, and they claimed eventually by 1920 the biggest furniture company in the world was Sturkey Brothers Furniture. They had, and this is credible because they had at one time had over 60 stores around the country, mainly in the Southeast. But they were, of course, anybody who's been in downtown Knoxville recognizes the Sturkey building on the northern part of South Gay Street. One of the largest buildings downtown, and I think this picture was probably taken inside one of the. There it is, yeah, one of those buildings that was built in the mid 1920s, when the founder of Sturkey's was still alive to direct things. But they were a German Swiss family. Another well-known German Swiss family were the Staubs, and Staub. Peter Staub was a Swiss immigrant who came here and came to America, originally founded a kind of a colony for Swiss people that he called Grutli. And if you go to Middle Tennessee, kind of southeastern Middle Tennessee, there's a place called Grutli Lager, which is sort of a resort type place. But he founded that place, kind of the way the Germans founded Wartburg. And Swiss people came there. They were disappointed. They got angry at him. So he came to Knoxville and started a new life here, and became much more successful here than he had been in Grutli Lager. Peter Staub, one of the first things he did after he got here was he built an opera house. And this is Staub's Opera House was really known as, and Staub's Theater later. It lasted for about 80 years, over 80 years, and was one of our main auditoriums downtown. This is right across the street from the Bijou Theater today on Gay Street, and it was actually bigger than the Bijou even after the Bijou was built. But Staub was a much respected guy. Was elected mayor about a year after he built this theater. By the way, he honored his own Swiss heritage by welcoming the very first show here. Was the story of William Tell. It was a story about a great Swiss hero at Staub's Opera House. But over the years, Peter Staub never really left his connection with Switzerland. He was a Swiss consul in America and later a U.S. consul in Switzerland, so he went back and forth quite a lot. His son Fritz Staub ran this theater in later years, and his grandson, Fritz Staub's son, was probably the best known architect ever born in Knoxville. His name was John Fans Staub, and he was kin to the Fans family, who was a partner of Ziegler. But these German-speaking people kind of stuck together in these days. But John Fanstaub is an architect actually better known in Houston today than in Knoxville, although he has two really remarkable houses in Knoxville that you can see. One is Hope Coat on UT campus, and the other is the Eugenia Williams house on Linus View. And we're going to have a talk later on in the year about Eugenia Williams and her mystery. But that great work of architecture that the youngest Staub. But I can't help but think that John Fanstaub was inspired by growing up with his family's name on a really impressive piece of architecture in downtown Knoxville, one that kind of changed Knoxville in many ways. This was really the first permanent auditorium in the city, and kind of was very, very well used by everybody from Frederick Douglass, who gave lectures there, to the Barrymores, to Sarah Bernhardt, W.C. Fields. All these great performers were at Staub's Theater over the years. So it's easy to understand how people appreciated Peter Staub, who was mayor twice of Knoxville, twice, with several years in between. but the German Swiss weren't the only Swiss. In fact, I think a larger group were the French-speaking Swiss who came to Knoxville, and they were here mainly as religious refugees. They were part of a religious sect that was somewhat more fundamentalist than others, but they were fundamentalists, but they were fundamentalists who loved to make and drink wine. So different from American fundamentalists. They were known for their festivals known as agape festivals that would be out in the country. The French Swiss were more rural than other groups that tended to gravitate toward the city. The Germans and Irish especially were mainly urban, eventually mainly urban people. All of the Sturkeys had a farm too. But the French Swiss preferred to kind of live a little bit apart, live out in the country, mainly on the northeast side of Knoxville, in the area that we know as Love Creek area, just on kind of southeast of where East Town Mall used to be. But it left their names all over it. Buffett Mill Road. Buffett was originally pronounced Buffat. It was a French Swiss name, and he had a mill there. Babely Road is another French Swiss name, and some of them are buried in Spring Hill Cemetery. One of them, these most interesting French Swiss people, is a guy named Frederick Esperandieu. I love that name. I think it means hope in God. But he was a professor of Romance languages and a winemaker. We have a kind of a rare picture of his country home. But he was actually had vineyards and was growing and making wine here in the 1850s. And in fact, this wine was so impressive that an Irish visitor, John Mitchell, said this is proof that Tennessee has a great future in winemaking. But Esperandieu, though, was eventually got a job teaching languages at UT, but he never could stop thinking about home. In fact, when the Franco-Prussian War, I mentioned that Julius Sachs was strongly supporting the Prussian side of the Franco-Prussian War. Frederick Esperandieu actually went to Europe during the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, and I think drove like an ambulance for the French. So he remained a French sympathizer his whole life. Interesting fellow. I'd like to know more about. But another guy is named, who's actually buried in a graveyard over at the Spring Hill Church, the old Presbyterian church there, which I think has a new persona now, Cross Point or something like that. But is a guy named Albert Chivans, or Chivon, as he may have pronounced it. He was born in Switzerland, grew up mainly here, but a fascinating figure in Knoxville history, unlike anyone else that I can think of. He called himself a sociologist, but if you read his work, he could take a few letters out. He was actually a socialist, but would love he pictured utopian societies in the future, and he wrote a couple of novels based on this perfect society that he placed in Africa. One was called Socioland, and he wrote a couple of novels about this. One was called In Brighter Climes, and these were kind of controversial at the time, as you might imagine. But he at this point was living in the downtown Knoxville area, actually near 4th and Gill area. And had his own printing press and was printing stuff off, but I wrote about him as just an oddity probably 25 years ago for Metropulse, and assumed that I was the only person in the world who'd ever heard of him. But I noticed that he's got a Wikipedia page. He's got kind of a cult following now in the 21st century. He may be more famous now than he was 50 years ago. His nephew, by the way, who was nothing like him politically, was named Ed Chivans, who was mayor of Knoxville in the 1940s. So the Chivans family, who were connected to the lumber business, were prominent and successful here for quite a long time. But the next group was one of the largest groups, perhaps the largest group of all these groups, and the German and Swiss immigrations had a lot to do with unrest, political unrest in Europe. This was completely another unrelated catastrophe. It was the famine in Ireland. Suddenly, the potato crops were failing, and everybody in Ireland was starving to death. And this was just a massive global tragedy that sent again many hundreds of thousands of Irish, starving Irish to America, just looking for any other answer to how they're going to spend the rest of their lives, because there wasn't a life for them anymore at their beloved home. But these were, some people claim that East Tennessee Irish are not real Irish. These people were real Irish, and you can tell by looking at this group of people. They look very, very Irish if you look at them up close. This is the original Immaculate Conception Church, just a small stone chapel, which I think this picture was built right at the time of the completion of the modern day church that's still there today. But look at the faces of these Irish who were many of them, I'm sure, immigrants who helped establish that the first Catholic church in East Tennessee in the 1850s. But the Irish became a very big part of Knoxville. They came here mainly to work on the railroad. Their catastrophe happened to coincide with the time that the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad was building the first railroad ever through East Tennessee, and needed a lot of people to help work on it. And a lot of Irish, they were hiring, and if you had a strong back and a couple of hands, they had a job for you in East Tennessee. And a lot of these young Irish men came here to work on the railroad. And and many of them didn't move very far away from it. They set up their homes near the railroad, and the area on the north side of Knoxville became known as Irish Town. It was kind of a separate community in a way that many Irish preferred not to mix with non-Irish, and they just stayed in Irish Town, and it was easy to stay there. They had their own saloons, their own bakeries, their own boxing rings, their own athletic fields where they played rugby, and eventually one of their concessions to America is that they decided they liked baseball, and they learned to play baseball there. But a lot of interesting people came out of Irish Town, which existed on the north side of town, mainly between Depot and Magnolia, roughly, kind of a long strip from over near Old Gray Cemetery over to where Caswell Park is today was Irish Town. But a fascinating group. One guy who lived there, and I don't think that he was very much. Not all Irish were Catholic. This group were Catholic. One was in fact an Irish revolutionary who was by faith. He was a Unitarian, but he had been thrown out of England for advocating violence against the crown in the 1840s. And this is the strangest story of all the Irish that I know of. He was sent to the penal colony at Tasmania, and lived there for a few years, escaped to the United States, and made his way, for reasons he could never explain to his friends, to a place called Knoxville. He arrived in Knoxville. He had only lived in Ireland, had never been around slavery before, but when he got here, he decided this was that he liked it, that this was the ticket for the answer for the Irish people who didn't have to be slaves at home. They could have slaves in America. That was his thinking. There were some Irish people who thought of abolitionism, which caught on in England before it caught on in most countries, as an Anglo-Saxon plot against the Celts. Now, it's a crazy idea, I know, but this is one idea of a way of thinking that appealed to John Mitchell. But an interesting and kind of weird guy. Do we have that picture? Yeah, there he is. But he arrived here in the early 1850s. Mentioned he wrote a letter home, and he said the only lively people around here are the Swiss. He said, and that's when he talked about Frederick Esrandieu and his wine and the destiny of East Tennessee as a winemaking country. But he began co-authoring a journal called The Southern Citizen with a local guy named William Swan, who had been mayor of Knoxville, and it became a secessionist paper. But he ended up moving to Richmond, the Confederate capital, and two of his three sons died fighting for the Confederacy. After the war, he decided he couldn't live here anymore. He went back to Ireland and was elected to British Parliament, believe it or not, and died before he could take his seat. But a fascinating and weird story. Thomas Keneally, who wrote Schindler's List, included a long passage about him in his book about the Irish in America and connected to the Civil War, both on both sides of the Union and the Confederacy. But one who fought for the Union side was a guy named Patrick Sullivan. He was another Irish immigrant who came here as a child, basically, and his parents were working for his dad was working for the railroad, so they came to Knoxville. Patrick Sullivan, not long after the Civil War, established his own business. He had a small grocery first, I think, and then a saloon. He built this in 1888, this kind of magnificent saloon, and the kind of the Richardsonian era style of Victorian commercial architecture. But had a great success with it. And Patrick Sullivan had been a Union soldier during the war. He was a very interesting guy. Central was not like any other street in Knoxville because Central was not really segregated in the rest in the way that either law or habit as the rest of Knoxville was. It was black and white. It was immigrant, and you would hear other languages on Central. You would hear this is the only place in town that you would hear people speaking other languages, including Italian, for example. But Patrick Sullivan had this saloon, and he allowed, in a time when saloons were for men, basically, he allowed women in his saloons, men and women both at the same time. And he allowed black and white people at the same time in his saloons. He did not discriminate at all. And this was an unusual place in those days, that in 1880s and 90s, that you could go into a place that was not segregated. But that was he was an interesting fellow, and this saloon stayed in business until saloons were banned altogether at the end of 1907. He had a partner named Dan DeWine, who was also an Irish from an Irish family. I think he might have been born in America, but he was from an Irish family who helped use his saloon earnings to buy a lot of property on the north side of town, including a place called Oak Hill, and he donated Oak Hill for what became St. Mary's Hospital. He thought it was important to have a Catholic hospital in East Tennessee, and this was the first one established mainly by an Irishman's saloon earnings. But anyway, this was kind of on the fringe of what was called a Irish town. Irish town was mainly to the north of here, but this is kind of the southernmost corner of it, I would say. But it's interesting how influential Irish town was. Politicians felt they had to go visit Irish town to get the Irish vote. The Irish were very political. They loved elections. They loved politics. And it's remarkable considering that the Irish were immigrants for one thing and Catholics for another. How quickly the Irish kind of folded their way into Knoxville politics. We've had three Irish Catholic mayors over the years. Over a period, Martin Condon was the first. We had an Irish Catholic mayor only about 6 or 8 years after Boston had their first Irish Catholic mayor, believe it or not. So this is they were pretty well accepted by this time. The Irish, by the way, were despised and ridiculed in the 1850s, but for some reason after the Civil War, the Irish had fought on both sides of the war. Americans decided they trusted them, and by the late 1860s, we were having giant St. Patrick's Day parades on Gay Street. And St. Patrick's Day was one of the biggest holidays of the year in Knoxville, for not only for Irish but for others. But the Irish would get together at Lamar House on Gay Street, and have an all-night party, basically an all-night dance, and would go into, they would serve breakfast in the morning to the revelers. But the guy in the middle, by the way, is a guy named John Paul Murphy, who was mayor of Knoxville for just a few days, actually, in 1904. But he was, for decades, was called the mayor of Irishtown. So he was the guy that kind of represented the Irish informally to the city. And the guy on the right is John T. O'Connor, and I'm sure recognize that name from the John T. O'Connor Senior Citizens Center, which is actually located on the eastern fringe of Old Irishtown over near Caswell Park. But he was mayor in the 1930s, and actually also the last Democrat to really cause a serious challenge to the Republican stranglehold on the second district congressional seat. He in 1936 just almost won. People actually were predicting that he was going to win until the rural votes came in, especially from Scott County, and suddenly this win turned into a very narrow loss. But anyway, these are interesting guys. John T. O'Connor, there was a great deal of, when he was elected mayor, there was a great deal of interest in Irishtown. Because he was from Irishtown and liked to talk about it. People had kind of forgotten that Irishtown never existed. It kind of faded away around the turn of the century. But John T. O'Connor had been the boxing champion of Irishtown. He wanted everybody to know that as a kid, and he was a union guy. He was a machinist who was a union organizer, just a kind of a classic tough Irishman. But he loved to tell tales of Irishtown, and people started saying in the 1930s, "What's Irishtown? What are you talking about?" And people started talking about it. And fortunately, reporters started going out and talking to other people who remembered Irishtown and kind of laying it out. So we have this in newspapers, these descriptions of Irishtown. Unfortunately, there's only one building left of Irishtown, as far as I can tell, and it was kind of from the late period of Irishtown, and it's I'm glad to say it's a saloon today. It's called the Central Depot. This is on the corner of Central and Depot, and this was an Irish saloon back in the 1890s. That was kind of just on the edge of Old Irishtown, not far from the what's now what later became the White Lily plant, which was actually built on the Old Irish rugby pitch. We had a few other kinds of people who came here. Thanks to the revolutions of 1848, a few Italians, a few, the best known were the Riccardi brothers, who were here in the 1840s, and they were well known in retail and real estate. You see their names a lot in the mid 19th century. But another fascinating family is the Grimaldi family, and I would like to find out more about this. But there was a guy who lived here in the 1870s named Thomas Grimaldi, who claimed to be more than 100 years old, and that he was kin to Monaco royalty, and that he himself was a former British sailor. And this is the 1870s. He was telling these stories, who had been involved in Navy battles with the U.S. ships in the War of 1812. But lived here in Knoxville and was much. Was a guy who caused much kind of a stir, and people would come around and want to talk to him and hear his fascinating stories. We'll talk a little bit more about Italians later on. The Italians have actually had a greater influence in Knoxville than we might imagine. We had a few, speaking of other people from other parts of the world, we had a few Chinese by the 1880s. There were some Chinese laundries. These were much considered better laundries than the average laundry. And we had a few Japanese, just very few Japanese, but none more influential than a guy named Ken Takahashi, who actually lived in Maryville, but was a Maryville College student, who is the guy, I'd love to throw him in there because he's the guy who introduced football to East Tennessee. He was the first known football quarterback to play in a game in East Tennessee. And in fact, he talked Maryville College students into starting a football program before UT had one. So this is the father of football in East Tennessee right there. He lived decided he liked Maryville, stayed working in Maryville College for some years. He was there for probably 10 years or so before he moved back to Japan, and died rather young. but a very interesting guy whose name we should remember. And also in the 1880s, we began seeing a number of Eastern European Jewish refugees, many of them escaping anti-Semitism and pogroms in the Tsarist era in Lithuania, Poland, Russia. They were more religiously conservative than their German predecessors. The first well-known rabbi was Isaac Winnick, who established his synagogue, which was different from Temple Bethel, more conservative than Temple Bethel, more fundamentalist, I guess we would think of it in other terms, on East Vine Street, which we think of as an African American part of town, but this is where he lived and where he had his synagogue. Fascinating stories that I ran across. Many of them I'd never heard until I did the research for the Old City book, which came out in 2019. One of a guy named Gerson Corkland, who was a guy who came here from Lithuania, I believe, but he had a really adventurous story about coming here. There was a shipwreck on the way, and he ended up being in Ireland for a while. But made his way over here and was selling potatoes on the corner of Jackson and Central, just one of several immigrants who was out there just trying to make some kind of a living. And this woman took a liking to him, this woman who claimed to be kin to Aaron Burr. And it turned out that she was kin to Aaron Burr. Her name was Amelia Burr. She was a widow of a guy named Burr who had been a partner in a lumber business it was actually located at the corner of Jackson and Central before that. And she said, would you like to have a store of your own? And she gave him a stake to start a store with. And he began this store that lasted for decades, became known as Corkland's Shoes later on. But also another great story from that same corner, and that corner of Jackson and Central, that's where you would run into people speaking other languages. There was a place called J.D. Cooper's, and it was a grocery. And it was in what's now the Boyd's Jig and Reel building. Many remember it as Manhattan's before that. But J.D. Cooper was there back around 1900. And J.D. Cooper, picture someone named J.D. Cooper in your mind. And you probably do not picture a Russian-born Jewish woman, but that's who J.D. Cooper was. I'm not sure what her born name was. But she had a popular store there and raised a bunch of kids there. Another of this era was a guy named Louis Lipner, who some of you may remember. He was on Market Square into the 1950s, maybe 1960s. But Louis Lipner was from Vienna. He was a kosher fishmonger, and he had set up a place on Market Square in the 1890s, I believe, and sold fish in the market house. And he had a kosher side and a non-kosher side. He didn't discriminate, but he was careful to keep these things separate. But he was the single most durable presence on Market Square. He had a shop there for 60 years, over 60 years. Louis Lipner, one of the best known Market Square merchants in history. Another of the Jewish German immigrants was a guy named Max Friedman, who was from Poland, and he eventually began working in pawn shops and so forth, but kind of really improved his brand a good deal when he moved into a big building on Gay Street at very near Wall Avenue. And had a jewelry store that wasn't just a jewelry store. It was kind of appliances. It was like a small department store, but a well-known guy in retail, but also a very well-known guy in politics. He was really fascinated with politics, as surprisingly a lot of immigrants were, and became a progressive in lots of ways. He actually met Franklin Roosevelt before he was elected in 1932. And they discussed the New Deal. He went up to New York and had a discussion with them as Roosevelt was just trying to decide what to call this thing. And Friedman, there were several options, and Friedman said, "Well, I like this New Deal idea," and that's what Roosevelt eventually picked. but he got involved in local politics as well. He was a councilman, elected to city council in the 1940s. Was a councilman was reelected many times. Was a councilman for most of the last 20 years of his life. Much respected here, and a kind of a supporter of progressive causes. But you see, a lot of these people are buried at New Jewish Cemetery, which is on Keith Avenue, and it says something that they keep the old Jewish traditions. The visitors put pebbles on the tops of the graves, and a lot of the graves are carved in Hebrew. They could be. They could be anywhere in Europe or New York or where else. It seems like you go there, and I've been there for a couple of funerals, and it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that you're in Knoxville at these things. But anyway, there are a lot of people, like a lot of us remember Harold Shersky very well. Harold Shersky was from a Russian Jewish family who ran Harold's Deli, and he and his family are buried at New Jewish Cemetery. A lot of people know when they think of immigrants in Knoxville and immigrant culture, they think of the Greek culture, because we do have, and it's one of the more visible, I guess, cultures here. Greeks came here as a result of a major economic collapse in Greece in 1893. Which was followed very rudely by a defeat in the Greco-Turkish War. It was Greece was a terrible place to be, just economically, in the late 1890s. And these were refugees from poverty, basically, who came to America looking for a different kind of a life. The first known Greek in Knoxville, and I looked into this story for the Old City book as well, was a guy that we knew as Bob Alexander. I think that he presented himself that way. Alexander is a vaguely Greek name, but we just wanted us to call him Bob. A scholar who I know only from something on file at the McClung collection has come to the conclusion that his real name was Konstantinos Kostoulis. But he was a sandwich maker, and originally was just a pushcart kind of guy that sold sandwiches up and down on Central Street, perhaps as early as 1898, 1899. There's lots of other evidence of early Greeks. There's a 1904 grave at Old Gray Cemetery, which is mainly, we know is from, kind of famous, locally famous, well-established families. But this is one sole grave down there that's carved entirely in Greek, and it's a guy named Nicholas Kolokithos, who worked in a restaurant on Central Street and until he was bludgeoned to death by a robber in 1904. Was buried there. But there are other people, other names from these early days that we don't recognize because they're not names of modern Greece. One of my favorites is Konstantinos Stergiakis, was an early restaurateur on Central Street. But they tended to name their restaurants after familiar American things, and I've heard that there was a tradition of naming your restaurant in honor of something that had to do with your trip over to where you arrived. So that's why we have the Manhattan Cafe, which became Manhattan's later on. That was a Greek place. The Atlanta Cafe and the Boston Cafe. But the Boston Cafe was down on Central Street. I'm sorry. We had one more picture of the Jewish merchants. That was the Morrisons, who ran the record store on Bell Sales Company on Market Square. Sam and Virginia Morrison, who ran this, turned out to be a very influential record store. They were broad-minded, and they had not only the latest R&B music, but the latest country music. And they had connections with a guy in New York who believed that anything that sold well at Sam Morrison's place was likely to go global, which happened in one case in 1954 when he found out that a new record by a guy named in Memphis named Elvis Presley was selling really, really well at Sam Morrison's store. So this was I'm glad we included that slide in there. But back to the Greeks and the Boston Cafe. The Boston Cafe. Oh, I'm sorry. We're I should have.
I'm losing you, Jack, here a minute.
Yeah. I've been following my notes, and Paul obligingly gave me a list of the slides in order, and I've just been reading from one sheet and not the other. Yeah, I've been promising a picture of the Boston Cafe. Here's the Boston Cafe. It doesn't look like much, but this was a place that was the best shorter order house on Central Street with 10 and 15-cent lunches in the 1920s. Anyway, that about at this time there were so many. I think literally most of the stores on this 100 block of Central were immigrant run, and this is the place that you would hear Italian, you would hear Greek language. I love the story that Bert Vincent told of people on the left side of this picture. One was an elderly Greek woman, and another was an elderly Italian man, a guy named Provenza, and the woman's name was Oriana Burgess. But they would go out. They didn't speak English. They didn't speak each other's languages, but they just liked each other. And they would sit out on the sidewalk every day, and she would make a pot of coffee, and they were just a couple of old people, and their kids were the ones who were learning English and running the store. But they would sit on the sidewalk and drink coffee and just laugh at all the crazy things they would see on Central Street, which was a lot of crazy stuff. But the Boston Cafe was one of about 7 or 8 Greek-owned places on this one block. At this time there were 66, 67 different businesses on this one block. You had businesses in back, you had businesses on top, you had businesses on the side, but they were all over the place down here. But there were Italian, Greek, Jewish, Lithuanian, all sorts of merchants down here. It was a fascinating place. I think remained that way until up until the mid 20th century, and many people say it was almost like a Middle Eastern bazaar, that you go down there and people would be in the sidewalk trying to sell you stuff. But it's I wish I remembered that better than I do. But that what is the next slide, Paul? You want to go back to the this is a great example of cross-cultural stuff. This was the pagoda was run by was owned by a couple of Jewish families who had immigrant roots in the Lamar House, which was built by an Irish immigrant, and of course it was the chef was a Chinese guy named Hui Yao. You see his name on the right side in the middle. This is 1932. This is the first Chinese restaurant in Knoxville history. So it's but this kind of a triply immigrant connected business, the pagoda. It was there for 5 or 6 or 7 years. I'm told that the tiles at the bistro today were laid down for the pagoda in the 30s, and obviously laid down very well because they seem pretty sturdy even to this day. But that's that. They sold both kinds of Chinese food, by the way, chop suey and chow mein. But all right, what's next? I'll just let you serve the slides, and I'll talk about them. All right, we're back to the Greeks now. This is the Regis Cafe. A lot of us remember Regis Restaurant, which looked nothing at all like this. This is the original cafe. The Regis Restaurant was a big, dark, kind of plush, fancy-looking place. This is a very clean tile floor diner, basically, and that's what when the Regis brothers from Greece opened this place in 1919, that's what they had in mind. And it was a great place because it was near the train station. People could grab a quick bite before their train left, or whatever. And so it was they did very, very well with that. Stayed in business for almost a century on that same spot. Their place was in the Watauga Hotel, which was on Gay Street at the corner of Magnolia. And over the years, they removed the upper floors of the Watauga and just left the operating parts of the Regus at the bottom. It was kind of a rundown hotel by that time. It was once a fairly nice place, but Regus name, and of course the Regus name remains on Regus Square today. One of the kind of the grandest, newest things in downtown Knoxville today is Regus Square. All right, next slide. All right, this is one of my favorite stories, and we're talking about the Italians again now. We just had a couple of Italians before, but this is one of the most interesting Italian stories. On the left, you see the name F. Ribori. Fiorenzo Ribori was a guy who was actually on his way to Memphis, an Italian who was coming through town on the train and was stuck in the snow. The train couldn't go any farther that day. So he said, "What can I do?" And he actually met another Italian named Raffaello Marmora, who was a fruit vendor. And Mr. Ribori, he said, "This is a great place to sell stuff in the street. Why don't you do it here instead of Memphis?" And he said, "Okay, I'll try it." And he started selling peanuts and eventually other things in the street. And this kind of this long, it's all not much more than a shack. It was kind of something that was connected to the building on the left, which is the Lawson McGee Library, built in 1885, the very first public library. And Ribori just built his shop on the side of the building and ran it very happily all day. He was there from dawn until midnight, typically selling peanuts and other things to people coming and going, especially from the train station. There's a lot of foot traffic along this part of Gay Street because of the train station. And some people just getting out of the train long enough to go over and buy something to get back on the train. So he did great with this business plan, and saved up some money. And after 30 years, he heard that the library was going to sell this building, and he kind of worried about it because he thought, whoever buys this building is probably not going to want me, some Italian peanut vendor on the side of the building anymore. And he actually he was afraid that they wouldn't sell it to an Italian immigrant. So he got his nephew, who I think was one of the Bricchettos, to go to the auction and kept and bid for the building. And this kid, who I think was only 14 or so, went into this auction and kept raising the bid. And the auctioneer was flustered by him. And he said, "Look, kid, if you've got $12,000, whatever it was, for the building, show it, and you can buy it." And the kid had it in cash and bought the building that day for his uncle Fiorenzo, who bought the building that he was connected to, but he didn't move into the building. He kept running his store, which was doing very well where it was, and rented the building and made a nice fortune for his family to live on. But a great immigrant story that I think we should all tell. But Fiorenzo Ribori was one of several Italian fruit sellers, vendors. There were here's a guy named Mike Armetta, who was from Sicily. He was an Italian ice cream maker. Italy's famous for ice cream, and Mike Armetta sold ice cream first. He bought Sullivan's Saloon. So this is a place with lots and lots of immigrant heritage already. And this is where his ice cream place was. It says Jackson and Central Street. But he didn't sell just ice cream. When America legalized liquor and beer in 1933, not everybody jumped at it, but the immigrants did. The first people to sell beer in Knoxville after the end of Prohibition were almost all immigrants. And Mike Armetta was one of the very first ones to sell beer. And he's talking about 5-cent beer in 7-ounce glasses. But talking about such as Tom Cavaleris uses at Manhattan Cafe across the street. So Cavaleris was a Greek immigrant who was also selling beer at this time. But this was, June 5th, 1933, right after beer was legalized. So this is Armetta is an interesting guy. He was a brother-in-law of Frank Provenza, but was involved in the Old City. If you look at the side of Sullivan's Saloon in certain light, you can still see the Armetta name near the round kind of porthole windows there. But there were other Italians, the Perucci Players, who were at the Bijou a lot, and also at Shallowy Park, was an Italian acting company. And here's a guy who was our best known stonecutter, best known marble sculptor, who was Albert Milani, who was worked out of the Candora company, was a very well known Italian sculptor, stonecutter. He did the big eagles on the side of the post office building on Main Street. By the way, there were several interesting Italians who were also stonecutters, named Jan, and I'm trying to remember, misplaced my notes. But one guy, a guy from the northern part of Italy that was kind of Swiss influenced. His last name was Y-O-N, which doesn't sound Italian at all, but he was he considered himself completely Italian. Oh yeah, here we go. Telesfero Jan was his name, and he came here to work on the Church Street Methodist Church building. I think he ended up staying much longer than he expected to. But his wife wanted to start a restaurant, and she did start a restaurant called Jan's Spaghetti Shop, and it was on Cumberland Avenue, and it was the very first Italian restaurant in Knoxville. See, they sell spaghetti, ravioli, minestrone, antipasto, lots of Italian stuff, but also chop suey and chow mein down there. That was really trendy then. That year, that was the same year that the pagoda opened, so everybody was looking for chop suey and chow mein. But they weren't. There was another family called Pellegrinelli who were also stonecutters, and they started an Italian restaurant up in Lincoln Park area. But also there are the Bricchetto brothers who had movie theaters on Gay Street and Market Square, and there were musicians. There was a guy named Tony Musco who was an accordionist and was one of the best known kind of sidemen in Knoxville in the 1930s and 40s, when most of the stuff they were doing was considered country music, although he did jazz too, but very well known and beloved Italian accordionist. Country music, by the way, is more exotic than it seems in lots of ways. Pee Wee King, who was co-wrote the Tennessee Waltz, his real name was Kaczynski. He was a Polish guy from Milwaukee. So, but Howard Armstrong, by the way, the great blues and jazz performer, said he learned Yiddish and Italian and German from playing in the streets in Knoxville, and learned to sing whatever language he wanted, just by growing up and down East Vine Street. But there's kind of a sad coda to all this kind of lively immigrant story, and that's by the time of World War I, people were becoming afraid of immigrants, afraid of foreign influences. This is the time of the first Red Scare, fear about anarchism, of the terrorists, and so forth. And by 1921, Knoxville, the city that had actually elected 6 immigrants mayor of the city, was bragging that Knoxville was free of the undesirable foreign influence, that we had a very small immigrant population, and they came up with a number. I don't know where they got the number, but they made this claim that they seemed to be the beginning of a time that in the mid 20th century that this idea of being an immigrant or being foreign was out of fashion, and people kind of lay low, and some people changed their names, and especially the Germans. Just kind of the Turnverein just ended suddenly at the time of World War I, when Germany was the enemy, and the Turnverein died as the name of a kind of a cheap little bar downtown. But there were other other things that stuck around, but you can, and I think in more recent years we've been seeing a new blooming of other immigrant cultures, especially Latino cultures in Knoxville, which may add their own two bits to the Knoxville story. But anyway, there's a lot more to the story. I love the story of the Chinese. There was a guy named Ben Kwok who was had a bookstore on Gay Street, who was a kind of a connoisseur of Chinese food, and also an intellectual who lectured on global politics and was a poet as well. But he was a Chinese immigrant who lived here, and I think would have been happy to stay here. He died rather young, but had invested in some real estate here. But others like the Min Cow building at UT campus. It was a guy who was just here for a few years, decided he wanted to invest in his alma mater, and here it is. It's a major part of the Hill today, and kind of a engineering computer science building. But there are lots of other, just look around and you'll see lots of other remnants of immigrant culture in this city as we know it today, just here and there. And in fact, it's kind of hard not to see immigrant influence on almost everything we think of in Knoxville, whether it's beer or football or anything else we think of as being elementally part of our hometown. There's a picture of Crouch Park. The Crouch family were part of this refugee wave after the revolutions of 1848. They respelled their name to make it easier for Americans to spell, but unfortunately, I think people see it and say crutch instead of Crouch now. But they originally had an umlaut and a few more syllables in it. Okay, that's the story. Do we have any more? Paul, I think that's close to the end of it, but there
last one.
So many things.
This is the last one.
Last one. Oh, of course. Yeah, that's right. I thought it'd be nice to end with this one. What's more elementally Knoxville than the courthouse, which has been there since 1885. And if you see county street signs all over the county, you see kind of a sort of a depiction of the courthouse on street signs. Well, the courthouse, if you look at this plaque on the side, it says Stevenson and Gittaz, it looks like, or Gittah as the architect actually pronounced it, I think. Gittah was a Swiss guy who grew up in France and learned architecture in Paris, but he was here in Knoxville working with Stevenson, who was an English immigrant, and they had their own architecture firm doing stuff mainly in the Knoxville area. But who would guess that you'd have these influences on a courthouse that's been there for 135 years now. But all right, be happy to take any questions or if there are any comments or all right. Well, thanks very much for joining us tonight. And we don't get paid for most of these, so we appreciate your help.